The storm had rolled in from the mountains before dusk, fierce and merciless, a wild white fury that erased the horizon and buried the trails. Wind screamed across the valley like a wounded animal, rattling shutters, tearing at fences, swallowing every trace of the living world beneath its breath. Luke Sawyer had seen plenty of winters in his 38 years, but never one that bit this deep. The snow had been falling for 2 days straight, heavy enough to bend the pines like old men bowing to prayer, and still it came. Relentless, cold, endless. The kind of snow that killed. He was mending a broken hinge on the barn door when he first saw the shadow moving across the white. At first he thought it was nothing, just wind and drift, but then it moved again, staggering, fragile. He narrowed his eyes, snow pelting his face, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. A figure, small and thin, stumbling through the storm with arms wrapped around herself. The wind howled around her like a pack of wolves, but she kept walking, though her steps faltered, though the snow reached her knees. Jesus, Luke muttered under his breath, dropping the hammer into the snow. He'd seen travelers freeze to death out here, seen the white claim men stronger than him. No one sane would be out in this weather. He trudged forward, the wind clawing at his coat. When she finally collapsed a few yards from the barn, he caught her before she hit the ground. She was light, too light, and trembling so hard her teeth clattered. Her skin was pale under the frost, lips almost blue, and when she blinked up at him through snowflakes clinging to her lashes, her eyes startled him. They were dark as midnight, slanted slightly at the corners and full of a terror that made his throat close. "Please," she whispered in a voice that was soft but cracked from cold. "Please, I just need to rest. Just the barn, only for tonight." Her accent was delicate, words careful, as if each one cost her strength. Luke stared at her, unsure if he was dreaming her up. She was no woman he'd ever seen in these parts, no rancher's wife, no settler. Her clothes were worn thin, not fit for snow, and a shawl clung to her shoulders like a prayer. "You'll freeze out here," he said roughly, more gruff than he meant to sound. "You can't stay in the barn. You'll come inside." Her eyes widened in panic. "No," she gasped, shaking her head. "I can work. I clean, I cook. Please, I don't want trouble." "You'll have more than trouble if you stay out here," Luke muttered, already sliding one arm under her knees. She tried to resist, weakly pushing at his chest. "No one marries a Chinese girl, sir," she said desperately, the words spilling from trembling lips. "But I can birth babies. I can serve. I won't be useless. Please let me stay." Luke froze for a heartbeat, the words cutting through him like ice. No one marries a Chinese girl. He didn't know what kind of hell she'd come from, but her voice told him it was real. And as he looked down at her, this trembling stranger who'd walked into death's arms, something inside him stirred that he hadn't felt in years. Not desire, not pity. Something deeper, the ache of seeing another soul half dead from loneliness. "Stop talking," he said quietly, lifting her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "Ain't nobody dying on my land tonight." Inside, the cabin glowed dimly with firelight. He laid her down near the hearth where the warmth touched her cheeks and chased some of the blue from her lips. The room was small, just one bed, a cot, a table, but it was clean and dry, and the fire threw golden light over the wooden walls. She curled closer to it instinctively, her fingers trembling as she reached toward the flames. Luke fetched blankets, wrapping her in them, then poured a cup of hot coffee, though she barely had the strength to hold it. "Drink slow," he said, kneeling beside her. "You're safe here." She looked up, eyes wet with tears that the firelight caught like tiny stars. "Why?" she asked hoarsely. "Why help me?" He shrugged, staring into the fire. "Because no one deserves to die in the snow," he said quietly. "And I reckon you look like you've done enough dying already." For a long time neither spoke. The wind clawed at the windows, but in the small cabin it felt far away. Her breathing slowed, her shivers eased, and when she finally fell asleep, he sat back and watched her. The storm outside might have howled till morning, but for the first time in a long time, Luke didn't feel like a man alone. When Luke opened his eyes again, the world had gone white and silent. The storm had laid its weight across the valley, smothering every sound. His breath fogged the cold air as he stirred from his chair by the door, boots still on, rifle across his knees. He hadn't meant to fall asleep. The fire had burned down to soft embers, painting the cabin walls in a faint amber glow. For a moment he forgot there was another heartbeat inside his home. Then came the soft clink of tin against iron, and he turned. She was there, Kneeling by the stove, hair unbound, the same dark silk that had clung to her face last night now hanging loose down her back. She moved with quiet grace, every motion careful, deliberate, as if afraid to disturb the air itself. The faint scent of something warm drifted toward him. Broth, maybe rice, though he hadn't had either in years. "You're awake," she said softly without turning, her accent lilting, wrapping around the English words like melody. "I cook for you. For say thank you." Luke rubbed the sleep from his eyes, blinking at her in the firelight. He didn't know what startled him more, the smell of food or the sound of another voice in his cabin. "You don't have to do that," he muttered, standing and stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. "You needed rest." "I rested," she said simply, stirring the pot. "Now I work." He moved closer, the floorboards creaking under his boots. "You got a name?" She paused for a long moment, as if the question itself carried weight. "Meilin," she said finally, her voice almost a whisper. "From Guangdong. Long time ago." She looked up, meeting his gaze for just a heartbeat before dropping it again. "You are Mr. Sawyer?" "Luke," he corrected gently. "Just Luke." Her lips moved around the name like it was something fragile. "Luke," she repeated softly, and for some reason it made his chest tighten. He sat down at the table, watching her move. The room felt alive in a way it hadn't since his wife, Clara, died 3 winters back. The ghosts in the corners seemed to have stepped aside for this living woman with her careful hands and weary eyes. When she brought him the bowl, he could see her hands were cracked and red from cold, the knuckles bruised. He wanted to ask what had happened to her, how she'd come to be wandering in a Wyoming blizzard, but her silence warned him not to. Some stories were better when told in their own time. Still, as he ate, he couldn't help but glance up. "Where were you headed?" he asked at last. Meilin hesitated, fingers tightening around the edge of her shawl. "Nowhere," she said. I work for family in the railroad town. They send me away when baby come." Luke froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. "Baby?" She nodded once, but her gaze went distant. "Little boy. He not live long. Winter take him." The words came flat, practiced, like she'd said them too many times to cry anymore. "Then I walk. No place to go, no people, only snow." Luke didn't speak. His throat closed tight, memories rushing back. The small grave behind the barn, his wife's pale face when the fever took her after their stillborn child. Pain had a way of recognizing itself. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She looked up at him, eyes shining like glass. "You also lose?" He nodded. "A wife. And a baby. Long time ago." Something passed between them then, an understanding, wordless and raw. For a long moment they sat in silence, the only sound the crackle of fire and the slow simmer of the broth. When she finally rose to rinse the bowl, Luke noticed how she winced when she moved her left arm. "You hurt?" he asked. "Old thing," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Railroad men."
Not kind. Luke's jaw tightened.
The world outside might have been made of snow and silence, but he could feel the heat rising in his chest. He wanted to find whoever had laid a hand on her and make them pay. Instead, he said softly, "You're safe here. Nobody's gonna hurt you again." She didn't answer, but her shoulders eased just a little. Over the next few days, as the snow piled higher, she began to fill the cabin with small traces of life. She swept, cooked, patched his shirts, and sang under her breath in a language he didn't understand. Luke found himself listening without meaning to. Her voice was soft and sad, but it carried warmth like a candle in a church that hadn't been used in years. He caught himself smiling sometimes, just hearing it. Once, while she hung laundry near the fire, he asked, "You ever think about going back? To California, maybe?" Meilin shook her head. "No home there," she said. "No place anywhere. I walk until snow stop. Then I find work again, but..." She hesitated, eyes flicking toward him. "This house, quiet, but not empty. I like that." Luke wasn't sure how to answer. The truth was, he liked it too. Her presence, her gentle hands, the soft rhythm of her steps on the floorboards. He'd lived in silence for so long that even the sound of her turning pages from the Bible on the shelf felt like a song. That night, when she lay down on the cot near the hearth and drifted to sleep, Luke sat awake by the dying fire, staring into the coals. He couldn't explain the pull he felt toward her. She wasn't like any woman he'd known. She carried her pain like silk carries light, soft but unbreakable. And though the storm outside had locked them in, he realized he didn't mind the prison, not this one. He leaned back in his chair, eyes on her small sleeping form, and for the first time in years the ache in his chest eased. Maybe it was the warmth of another human near him. Maybe it was the way she'd whispered his name. Whatever it was, it felt like something waking from a long, hard winter. Outside, the snow fell on, endless and pure. Inside, beside a fading fire, two lonely hearts began to thaw. Slowly, cautiously, but without doubt that the warmth between them was real. The storm did not break for 7 long days. Outside, the mountains disappeared into a curtain of white, and the wind howled like a living thing, clawing at the roof as though it wanted in. But inside Luke's cabin, something softer had begun to grow, something that did not belong to winter. Each morning, he woke to the quiet sound of Mei Lin humming near the fire, her sleeves rolled up as she tended to the pot or brushed snow from the windowsill. The rhythm of her voice had become part of the place, blending with the crack of wood and the sigh of the kettle. It was not the language of the frontier or the rail camps. It was the language of life returning. Sometimes she would pause when she caught him watching her. Her cheeks would color faintly and she'd duck her head as though unsure whether to smile. He'd pretend to be busy with something else, sharpening tools, fixing a hinge, but the silence between them carried its own conversation. One morning, he found her standing by the window, staring out at the endless white. Her shawl was thin, her hands pressed against the frost-glazed glass. He walked over quietly and laid his coat around her shoulders. She stiffened for a moment, startled by the contact, then turned her head toward him. "You don't have to do that," she said softly. "You'll freeze without it," he answered. "You're too small for this kind of cold." She gave a small, almost shy laugh. "I lived through worse. Snow not scare me," he smiled faintly. "Still, I'd rather you didn't prove it." Their eyes met, and for the briefest instant the cabin felt too warm, too full of breath and something unspoken. She turned away quickly, clutching the coat closer. That night he found her asleep in front of the fire, her head resting against the side of his old armchair. The flames painted her face in gold and amber, softening the sharp edges of exhaustion. He crouched down beside her and gently pulled a blanket over her shoulders. As he did, her hand twitched, brushing his fingers. He froze, breath caught. Her touch was light, but it carried a weight he hadn't felt in years. A quiet reminder that he was still a man and she still a woman. He should have looked away. Should have stood up, gone outside, and given his heart no ground to build upon. But instead he stayed there, watching her sleep while snow whispered against the windows. In the following days they grew closer without meaning to. Mei Lin began to talk more, little pieces of her story slipping through the cracks of her careful silence. She told him about her village by the Pearl River, where lanterns floated every new year and her father carved boats that could glide like swans. She spoke of her journey across the ocean, how she'd believed America would be made of gold only to find it built on men's cruelty. Luke listened without interrupting. He didn't know how to ease the hurt that flickered in her voice, but he knew what it was to carry pain quietly. Sometimes, when she fell silent, he told her small stories of his own. The colt that kicked him clean through a fence, the day Clara laughed so hard she spilled coffee down her dress. And though he never meant to, he found himself saying her name less and less, replaced by the quiet rhythm of Mei Lin. One evening she asked, "You still love her? The wife who gone?" Luke stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "I'll always miss her. But love changes. It doesn't die, it just turns into something you carry, not something you give." She nodded slowly, her dark eyes reflecting the flame. Maybe you give again. One day." He looked up then, and for the first time didn't look away. "Maybe," he said softly. Snow fell again that night, gentle this time. A hush that seemed to bless the valley instead of bury it. Luke found himself stepping outside after supper, the lantern casting a golden circle around his boots. The world glowed pale and silent. He thought he was alone until he heard the door creak and Mei Lin's footsteps crunch in the snow. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, turning toward her. "I want to see stars," she replied. Her breath rose in soft clouds as she tilted her head back. "In my country, my mother say stars are our ancestors. If you lost, you follow their light. They show way home." Luke looked up with her. The sky was so clear now it seemed you could fall into it. "Then I guess we've both got someone watching," he murmured. She smiled faintly, her face silvered by moonlight. Then after a pause she said, "Sometimes I think maybe storm not punish. Maybe storms send us where we belong. He turned at that, surprised by the quiet strength in her voice. And before he could stop himself, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She froze, half in fear, half in disbelief, but she didn't pull away. Her eyes searched his, uncertain, questioning. "Mei Lin," he said softly, the name barely a breath. "You don't have to be afraid here." Her voice trembled when she answered, "I'm not afraid of you, Luke." That single sentence hit him deeper than he could have imagined. They stood there, side by side in the snow, two souls who'd lost everything, finding warmth in the one place they never thought to look. The stars above them burned cold and eternal, but in the small space between their shoulders, something fierce and fragile began to burn, something human. When they went back inside, she lingered by the door, eyes downcast. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Luke shook his head slowly. "No, Mei Lin, I think maybe you're saving me." The words hung between them like a vow neither had planned to make. The fire crackled, the snow sighed outside, and for the first time since he'd lost his family, Luke Sawyer felt the weight of loneliness lift from his chest. That night, as he lay in bed listening to the soft sound of her breathing across the room, he realized that love was not always thunder or fire. Sometimes it was just two people surviving the same storm and finding in each other a reason to stay warm. By late February, the snow had stopped falling every night, and a different kind of silence had settled over the valley, the kind that comes when winter begins to think about letting go. Each morning the drifts shrank just a little, and drops of meltwater traced thin silver lines down the cabin's logs. Luke noticed it first in the way the air smelled, pine instead of frost, wood smoke instead of the sharp bite of ice. Mei Lin noticed it in the way the birds returned, timidly at first, flitting from branch to branch as if testing whether the world was still kind. Inside, life moved to a slower rhythm. The chores had changed from surviving to mending. Luke spent long hours outside clearing paths to the barn, while Mei Lin stitched new curtains from scraps of old flour sacks, humming as she worked. Sometimes she would open the door to hand him a mug of coffee, and he'd catch a glimpse of her face framed by steam and sunlight, her hair glinting dark against the white. Those small moments began to take root in him, tiny seeds of warmth buried deep where the cold couldn't reach. One afternoon he found her kneeling in the snow behind the cabin, her hands deep in the earth where the snow had melted away. "What are you doing?" he asked, leaning on his shovel. "Looking," she said without turning, soil still alive. She held up a handful of dark, wet dirt. "Even after long winter, it wait. Like people?" He crouched beside her, watching the brown thawed earth spill through her fingers. "You think people can come back like that?" She glanced at him, eyes bright in the pale sun. "Yes, you come back. You were dead inside when I find you." Her words startled him with their simple truth. He wanted to deny it, but he couldn't. She'd seen through him as easily as through glass. He tried to laugh it off. "And you? You weren't?" She smiled faintly. "I was ghost. Now I eat, I sing, I feel warm again. Maybe we both not ghosts anymore." He looked at her then, really looked, the way the wind caught the ends of her hair, the faint blush on her cheeks from the cold. And for the first time since Clara's death, he felt something that wasn't grief. It frightened him and comforted him all at once. That evening, the thaw brought fog, soft and white as breath. Mei Lin stood by the fire, brushing out her hair, the strands shimmering in the orange light. Luke sat at the table pretending to whittle, though his knife barely touched the wood. He found himself listening to the sound of her comb moving through her hair, the slow, rhythmic sweep that seemed to fill every corner of the cabin. "You ever think about staying?" he asked quietly. Her hand paused mid-stroke. "Staying?" "Here, when the snow's gone." She didn't answer right away. "Maybe I go when trail open," she said finally. "But I don't know where." "There's room here," he said, eyes fixed on the carving in his hand. More than enough. The silence that followed felt fragile, like thin ice over deep water. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "If I stay, people talk." "Let them," he said simply. "I've had enough of ghosts." The next morning, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks. The world glittered with meltwater and the air smelled new. Luke saddled his mare for the short ride to town for supplies. Mei Lin handed him his gloves at the door, her fingers brushing his. "You be careful," she said. "I always am." "Men who say that," she murmured, "come back with blood." He laughed softly. I'll come back with coffee instead. When he returned that evening, the wind carried the sound of her singing long before he reached the cabin. It was a slow, wistful song that wound through the trees like smoke. He stopped his horse and just listened. The melody was in a language he couldn't understand, but the feeling in it was clear, a kind of prayer, half sorrow and half hope. He found her standing on the porch, watching the sunset. The light spilled over her face, turning her eyes to amber. That song, he said, dismounting. What's it mean? She hesitated. It mean when river melt, heart melt too. Then spring's coming, he said softly. She nodded, smiling. Maybe for river, maybe for heart too. They ate together that night in easy silence, the kind that comes only when words are no longer needed. Afterward she poured tea, and he sat close enough to feel the warmth of her sleeve brushing his arm. Outside, the snow dripped steadily from the eaves, a slow rhythm like the ticking of time itself. Luke, she said suddenly, her voice small. If I stay what I am here? Servant? Guest? He turned toward her, heart thudding. Neither, he said. You'd be my partner, my equal. If you wanted that, her breath caught. People say Chinese woman cannot be wife to white man. He reached across the table, taking her hand gently but firmly. I don't care what people say. You've brought life back to this place, to me. If that's not worth marrying, I don't know what is. For a long moment she didn't move. Then her fingers tightened around his, trembling. You sure? Never been surer. Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled through them. Then when spring come, I stay. He rose and pulled her into his arms, the motion slow, reverent. She fit against him like something that had always belonged there. The fire crackled behind them, the snow whispered outside, and the world seemed to pause just to witness it. When their lips met, it wasn't passion born of hunger, but of recognition. The meeting of two souls who had wandered too long in the cold and finally found the same fire. The kiss was gentle, lingering, full of promise. Outside, the snow continued to melt, water singing through the eaves. Inside, the warmth they had kept alive all winter burned steady and bright, lighting the small cabin with a glow that even the long shadows of the mountains could not dim. Spring was coming, and with it the kind of love that could outlast any storm. By mid-March, the valley had turned from white to gold. Snow retreated up the mountainsides in ragged scarves, and the rivers, newly freed, rushed down with a song so loud it filled the hollows. Luke's cabin stood amid a meadow of first shoots, frail, green, and brave. He had never seen this land look so alive. Maybe it had always been this way, he thought, but he had simply forgotten how to see. Now every color seemed sharper, as if the long months of snow had scrubbed the world clean for their beginning. Mei Lin worked in the yard beside him, sleeves rolled high, hair bound with a strip of blue cloth she'd found in one of Clara's trunks. She planted tiny seeds in straight, careful rows, beans, cabbage, marigolds. Luke had offered to plow deeper furrows, but she only smiled and said, "Roots grow strong when hands touch them." He liked the way she said roots, as if she meant more than plants. Word of their life together had already reached town, carried on wagon tongues faster than spring wind. "Sawyer's taken up with a railroad girl," some said with disdain. Others called it unnatural. Luke had expected that. He'd lived long enough to know the West could be crueler with its words than with its weather. But when he told Mei Lin, she only looked at him calmly. "They not feed us, they not love us," she said. "So why their words matter?" Her quiet certainty shamed him a little. It also steadied him. They decided to marry without permission, without witnesses except the mountains themselves. Luke rode into town one morning and found the preacher sweeping dust from the church steps. "Reverend," he said, "I aim to be married." The old man squinted. "To that foreign woman up your ridge?" Luke's answer was simple. "To the woman who saved my life." The preacher studied him for a long while, then nodded once. "Bring her at first thaw," he said. God made no rule about color of skin, only about faith. When Luke returned and told her, Mei Lin's eyes filled with light. "We marry under trees," she whispered. "Not in walls. Heaven see us better there." And so it was decided. The night before the wedding, a soft rain came, washing the last of the snow from the roof. Luke couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, oiling his boots, thinking about everything that had brought them here. The storm, the hunger, the laughter that had grown between them. He felt as if he were standing at the edge of something holy. When Mei Lin came from her room in a plain white dress she had sewn herself, The firelight caught on the small silver pin at her throat, one of Clara's given freely. Luke rose, breath leaving him. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. She smiled. "You still ask that?" He took her hands. They were calloused, the hands of someone who had worked for every breath of peace she'd ever known. "I just never thought I'd get a second chance." She lifted his hand to her cheek. "Then don't waste it worrying." Outside, dawn was breaking, pale and clean. They saddled the mare together, and when he helped her up, she laughed softly. The sound startled birds from the trees and sent them wheeling into the pink sky. Luke swung up behind her, arms around her waist, the warmth of her back against his chest. The scent of her hair, soap, pine, a little smoke filled his lungs. He had never felt so alive. They rode out beyond the ridge where the last snow lingered in shadow. The grass there was soft with new shoots, and a stand of aspens quivered in the morning light. The preacher waited by a fallen log, Bible in hand, hat held respectfully against the wind. He looked older out here, smaller somehow, but when he saw Mei Lin, his eyes softened. "The Lord sets many kinds of people in his garden," he said quietly. "Best we learn to tend all of them." Luke dismounted first and helped her down. She stood for a moment looking at the mountains that hemmed the world around them. Mist moved through the trees like breath. She whispered something in Chinese, too soft to catch. "What did you say?" he asked. "I thanked the wind," she said simply. "It carried me here." The ceremony itself was brief. The preacher spoke the words, his voice steady against the sigh of branches. Luke repeated his vows with a roughness that wasn't from doubt but from awe, to keep her safe, to honor her courage, to share bread and fire until the Lord himself called them home. When it came time for her to speak, Mei Lin's voice trembled but did not break. "You give me back the sky," she said. "Before you, I only looked down." Luke took her hands. "Then keep looking up," he murmured and kissed her. The preacher closed his Bible with a gentle snap. "What God joins, no winter can undo." They stayed a while after he rode away, just the two of them beneath the awakening trees. Sunlight spilled through the branches in long golden ladders, and somewhere a river laughed over stones. Mei Lin knelt and pressed her palm to the damp earth. "Now we plant," she said. Luke joined her, pushing his hand beside hers into the soil. Together they buried the first bean seeds of the season, tiny green promises beneath the black earth. In the weeks that followed, their world filled with color. The cabin wall smelled of baking bread and wildflowers. Luke built her a small wooden porch where she could sit in the evenings and sew. Sometimes when he came in from the fields, he found her humming lullabies to the growing garden, her belly already rounding beneath her apron. He would stop and listen, heart so full it ached. "Boy or girl?" he'd ask with a grin. She would smile back. "Healthy," she'd say. "That's enough." By midsummer, the townsfolk's whispers had faded. The same men who had scowled now tipped their hats when they passed. Children came to trade berries for the little paper birds Mei Lin folded with deft fingers. Luke never tired of watching her laugh with them, her voice mingling with the rustle of leaves. The loneliness that had haunted him for years was gone, replaced by something still and bright. One evening, after the day's heat had cooled, they walked down to the river. Fireflies flickered in the reeds. Mei Lin leaned against him, her hand resting over the small life moving beneath her ribs. "You hear that?" she whispered. "The frogs?" "No," she said, smiling. "The world breathing." He listened, and she was right. The whole valley seemed alive with quiet sound. Water, wind, heartbeats. He tightened his arm around her. "Guess it's not such a lonely place after all." When they reached the cabin again, the moon was rising. Luke lit a single lamp, its glow spilling through the window into the dark. Mei Lin turned in the doorway and looked back at the land that had nearly killed them both and yet had given them everything. "Winter will come again," she said. He nodded. "Let it. We know how to keep warm now." Inside, the fire crackled, gentle and sure. Outside, the river carried spring onward, toward seasons they hadn't yet seen. And on that quiet night, under the endless western sky, Luke Sawyer and Mei Lin held each other close, the snow far behind them, the promise of life ahead, two souls no longer adrift, bound by a love strong enough to weather any storm.